I'm
All
ready
right.
to talk about it.
Well, that's good. So I'm recording right now. So yeah, so we can, of course, go ahead and discuss this wonderful, amazing topic that is sibling estrangement. I think both you and I are familiar with that. And I think that this is something that will be useful to a great number of viewers that may be going through a similar situation and maybe even gain some insight out of this. So hopefully
Well,
we.
I think the best place to probably start is by introducing ourselves. So why don't you talk a little bit about yourself, Ali John, and I'll then tell you a little bit about me.
Sure, I think that's good. That's a good start. Absolutely. So my name is Ellie John Chaudhary, psychotherapist. I've been a psychotherapist for about 14 years now. I enjoy my work tremendously, and sibling estrangement is something that I've experienced myself personally, and at the same time, it's been a catapult for me to do these videos because I've always wanted to um, go further than what our conversation could be with regards to my sibling, and I was never allowed to do that because of circumstances where communication would break down. So I did a bit of research, and I was very surprised to see that there were more people that were going through a similar situation than I realized. So for me, that was a big eye opener, and I decided, well, it's time for us to have a conversation on this, and that's when I started doing some videos. And you know, it's interesting because a lot of my clients were talking to me. I was asking them if they're close to their family, and oftentimes people would say to me, well, you know, I'm not too close to my brother or sister, and I was like, okay, well, is there something going on there? And people would normally not talk about it. They wouldn't really take the time or give themselves the space to do that. And I think this is a conversation or a subject that often gets brushed off or brushed away, and people don't want to necessarily talk about something that is paining them as much. So
I
so
think there are a lot. I think there are a lot of reasons for it, and actually, that I think that's a great place for us to start. Why don't people talk about this? And I believe there are a lot of forces at work, stigma, and other things that we can explore in just a couple of minutes. But I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Fern
absolutely.
Schumer Chapman, and I'm actually the author of several books, but I recently embarked on a memoir about reconciling with my brother after 40 years of estrangement. And the upcoming book, which will be released in February of 2021, actually is part memoir. And then, of course, it explores the psychology and the issues behind sibling estrangement. And I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Ellie John, about this idea that nobody wants to talk about it, and it's incredibly pervasive throughout most societies. It cuts across all classes and religions and cultures. And I think it's so profoundly unacknowledged. And the reason I say that is every single time I went out into the world and said, I'm working on a book about sibling estrangement and reconciliation, people would say to me, oh my gosh, do I need that book?
Mhm.
So that gave me a real opportunity. But let's talk a little bit, and I'd like to hear your opinion as to why this is so stigmatized.
Well, I think that there's the societal expectation that we should be somehow having good relations with all of our family members. I think that this is something that comes up on a regular basis, and we're taught at a very young age that you should be getting along, and that somehow if you're not, then it's your fault. You're causing something, and parents tend to have favorites in some cases, and I think that happens where certain behaviors may be excused while the family interacts with one another in that way. And what happens sometimes is that those relationships can go sour during those interactions. And what can cause that to happen, of course, is that sense of inequality and the sense that certain behaviors are allowed to continue while they perhaps shouldn't. So I think parents tend to put on blinders when it comes to their kids in that way. And I think that this is something that parents need to work on overall. But there's certainly a chemistry that starts to happen, because once this starts to happen at a young age, I think it builds from there. It builds from a specific time, and it can go into adulthood, and people perpetuate these roles. It's like we become pigeonholed and come back into these roles whenever we're in our own family dynamic.
Regressing.
Yeah. So in some ways, some people they start to feel depleted, drained. There's all sorts of different symptoms that come with that, that bring along that sense of estrangement that can cause relationships to break down.
I think also there's a tremendous shame attached to estrangement. And if you go out into the world and you say, I'm divorced, people don't bat an eyelash. Or if you go out into the world and say that I really don't get along with my mother, people kind of shrug their shoulders. But if you say that I can't get along with my brother, I think there's a suspicion of you.
Yeah.
If you can't maintain a relationship with your own family member, with your own sibling, what does that say about you? And are you trustworthy as a friend? So there are all sorts of really complicated stigmas attached to.
Absolutely. I would agree with you.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think there's many things going on all at once in that way. And like you say, there's a sense of shame that builds, because there's the idea that it reflects back on you, as if there's something wrong with you as an individual for not being able to maintain good relations with your family members. Or it can kind of...
That really plays into self-esteem. That really plays into how you see yourself. So this thing that we're talking about, which is sibling estrangement, is not a nice, neat, contained problem, because what happens is it affects how you see yourself, how you relate to others, whether you can trust others. It's almost like a cancer.
Yeah, and it's true, because it, like you say, I think it plays on your own self-image, and again, you start to have different ways of seeing people, and it's again, I think there's a lot of different things. There's the sense of shame. There's self-image issues that can come up because you may be pigeonholed into some of these roles, and again, the societal expectation makes that you're having to experience something that has never been openly talked about. And it's almost as if the onus is on you to somehow fix it or somehow be okay with it. And again, I call this a sense of over responsibility when it's pushed on us by parents or others within the family unit.
And society as a whole has this large expectation that family relationships are foundational, and you are not to break or violate what is expected in terms of the family. And I think that gets to be very complicated. And there are sometimes justifiable reasons to leave that relationship, but nonetheless, people view it as a profound violation. There's another piece of this too, which I think when I've gone out into the world and talked about sibling estrangement, there's almost like a fear that this might be contagious. You know, people are very nervous. They're curious about it, but they're also worried that this could happen to them. So there's a resistance to talking about it just from that.
Yep. Yeah, I think that there's a hesitation because, again, we're putting light to certain areas that, you know, may be people's blind spots, and people
and they prefer to deny.
Yeah,
they might prefer to deny it.
Exactly. That's why they call it a blind spot. It's like people don't want to look at it in that way. It takes effort to look at it, or it actually takes help from somebody else to be able to see it. So sometimes it's necessary to be able to go further and to put words to that. And sometimes, I think that consulting for some of these issues is certainly a valid reason to go into therapy for this. So by all means, I
will say, as somebody who's endured sibling estrangement, it's probably the most profound grief that I've experienced. I felt like for 40 years, when my brother had nothing to do with me, I was mourning the living. I just could not move forward. It created a sense of stuckness that really never left me. And I think I felt like it capped my ability to be happy, because in the back of my mind, there was like this little acid drip that my brother doesn't talk to me. Very painful.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think that it is painful when you know that inside of you, you have the innate capacity to go further. You know you're not developing your full potential within that relationship because it's a shared responsibility. It's not all up to you. And yet at the same time, you want to go further, but if the other person doesn't want to in that way, then it makes it harder. And it's like you got your foot on the gas and the other person's got their foot on the brake. So it's you're going like this back and forth, and it's hard because of that. Because again, you feel your capacity, you feel that you have it in you, and you know you're a wonderful person, and you know yourself for your qualities when your self-esteem is good. And it's unfortunate that the other person is not willing to acknowledge that.
Well, and it's even more complicated than that. And I know you only have one sibling, and I only have one sibling. And so without that connection to my only brother, I lost the entire branch of that family and the sense of belonging to a family.
Yeah.
So it was devastating.
I understand that, and I remember my sister. Of course, she has kids, and it's the same with me too. I think that I'm not able to cultivate those relationships, and there's a certain sadness with that, because it's not that I don't want to. It's not that the willingness is not there. It's simply that the chemistry makes that it just doesn't happen, and for whatever reason, again, and maybe some background issues we talked about in some of the videos,
young children can't go around their parents and form a relationship with an aunt or uncle. And so you sort of have to wait for them to grow up, and they're not necessarily going to go against what their parents have, stipulated throughout their lives. So they're, the other thing is if you don't build these relationships when the children are very young, they don't happen. And if there's estrangement when there are young families, and you decide that you've reconciled, and this has happened in my life, and then you want to rebuild these relationships, not everybody's going to get on board.
That's true.
There's a lot of anger and a lot of resentment because you weren't in their lives for all those years, for whatever reasons. And sometimes you don't even know the reasons that were given for why you weren't in their life.
And you're absolutely right. And that's the hard thing too, is that there's a window to be able to build something when they're young like that. And I would agree with you. But I also conclude largely the same thing as you, is that when they become adults, they're going to be able to make their own decisions. They're going to be able to live out their own lives and be self-determined individuals. So hopefully they would reach out and say, well, I've got this uncle, I've got this aunt that I can go and see and find out more about them, because there's what, my parents said, but there's my own experience too. And I want to kind of know firsthand what that is. So,
I think it's pretty challenging. I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience. It's pretty challenging if you have not had a consistent relationship with a niece or nephew to suddenly begin to build that relationship when they're in their 20s.
Yeah.
I have tried to do that, and I have some relationship, but they're just not warm to it at that stage. They have their own lives, and they've managed to have a life without you for so many decades that they don't really know how to fit you into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing too. There are life stages, and again, it's where those poignant moments build, and there's a concept called shared living that has to do with having these moments or these experiences where there's almost like a form of learning that happens within the context of an activity of some sort. And like you said, if you don't have that when you're younger, then you're not really building memories to rest upon, to use as a reference point to connect you to that person. So you're right, there's something that's lost. And I think, like you said earlier, there's a grieving, and it is a grieving situation, the grieving of the possibility of what could have been as opposed to what it is now. And I applaud you in all honesty for being able to cultivate that relationship with your adult nieces in that way. So I just want to say that that's a good thing. That's actually an inspiration.
I try. I don't know that it's all that successful, but it feels a lot more comfortable than it did all those years when there was no contact whatsoever.
Mhm.
I think I think it's important for us too to discuss the two players in all of this. There's the person who does the shunning, so and the person who is shunned.
Yeah.
And I was the one who was shunned,
Mm.
and I didn't know why. And this is something that I have heard over and over again. There's probably nothing more confusing than someone cutting you out of their life and never giving you a reason.
Yeah. You know, they call that on the internet, I think that's called ghosting now. There's
Yeah,
a word for that. Where
right.
back
I was ghosted before they had the label for ghosting.
but it's interesting, you know, it's a good word because it's like there's no explanation. It's like the person flat out disappears and there's no news about what happened or what it is that occurred. And it's like watching a movie and not getting the ending. That really plays on somebody's mind, I think, in that way. So I think it's important to have an explanation or a reason of some sort. And we're creatures of narration. That's why myths and stories are so important to us. You know, it's because of that reason. And because there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if all of a sudden there's an abrupt interruption in a relationship, then there's something that happens that the narration of the story is just put on hold. And that's where it becomes hard, because this is where the mind starts to wander, and it goes into, perhaps I would say, a dangerous territory, where it starts to kind of think, oh, you start to wonder if there's not something you may have said or done. And that's when you start to kind of pluck your feathers, figuratively speaking, you know. So I think it's important to be careful with that, and not to always envision a negative outcome on our part necessarily, as much as the other person not being able to experience a sense of emotional comfort while being with us. And I'm basing this also on my own personal experience, but I do think that this happens also with others, because to experience a sense of closeness, it requires a sense of vulnerability. And if the other person's not comfortable with that vulnerability, then all excuses are good to not participate in that. So whatever it is, I would say it's mostly on them and less on us as being the shunned person.
I think too, I mean, I know I had a tendency to ruminate without a doubt. And there's another issue that's tied to this. If you are shunned and you don't know the reason why, well, estrangement occurs because there's terrible communication between two people.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's fitting that you wouldn't have a reason, because you don't have the social skills to sit down and talk about what happened and what's upsetting you and
Yeah.
why we have ended up in this way. So
Mhm.
it's really, it feeds on itself.
It does, and that's the thing. People stay with that sense of awkwardness, and they use that as their reference point, as opposed to saying, well, maybe I should get beyond that. And that's the thing too. I think that a lot of times, just because we have a feeling doesn't mean that that feeling is real or based on reality. And I think this is a big misconception that a lot of us can have, including the person that does the shunning, is that they experience a sense of discomfort and they believe that to be fact or reality, whereas it's not. It's a simple feeling of some sort that emerges, and for whatever reason, again, and there can be many reasons like we've mentioned, but it's important to go further than those feelings. And that's something that I think every individual needs to work on. And this is where, as you said, you know, that ability to be able to be social and to interact accordingly is very important. So absolutely. There's certainly a question of emotional intelligence here, yes.
Right. So if you happen to have a sibling who is not particularly socially capable and maybe not emotionally intelligent, how do you sustain a relationship with that person? And I think what tends to happen is that if some of those social skills and communication skills were not modeled in the family, kids don't learn those skills. And as a result, they don't know how to connect. They don't know how to overcome differences between them.
Mm. I think, as you say, it's true. We need to have some of these experiences shown to us as a reference point by parents. But I think there's also like innate qualities also. I think there's some people that tend to shy away from discomfort as opposed to asking, well, what is this? Why am I experiencing this? So I think that you and I are comfortable in doing that if that happens. But I think there's other people that are just not. And yes, I think examples, practical examples within the family would be hugely helpful. And this is where the whole role of the parents comes in too, in that way, to be able to share and to be able to help manage conflict, as opposed to saying, "Can't you guys just get along?" There's more to it than that.
Well, a lot of times too, and this was the case in my situation, the person who's doing the shunning may be hiding something.
Mm.
And that was the story for me.
Mm.
And my brother was drinking, and he did not want the family to know. So, but meanwhile, I had completely personalized all this and thought I had done something, and there was some reason. And it was certainly, I can't say I was blameless, I wasn't, but I think the predominant reason, and there are many factors that play into it, but the predominant factor was that he was hiding.
Yeah. So I think that's a huge point you're bringing up. And if you were able to bring out the elephant in the room in the conversation, then I think that's huge to be able to do that, and that you guys were able to zero in on that together. That's where you were able to build one of those shared living experiences in that way, by having a moment together and to be able to talk and cultivate that. And I do think that work with regards to alcoholics and substance abusers has to do with bursting that illusion. And that's such important work because it requires you to work on yourself as an individual. And I think for your brother to be able to go into that place, he understood that he needed to go there to free himself of that. And you were there with him, so I can only imagine how that must have cultivated that sense of closeness together in that way.
Well, that certainly was part of it, but then the other shared experience, which is pretty ironic, is that he wanted me to write this book about sibling estrangement, and he supported me, and as a result, that became a shared experience.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And you can see how just putting words to that is just so powerful, and how both of you were kind of able to experience that sense of togetherness. And that's really what it's all about. I think it's that sense of togetherness, and that must have really fostered a form of healing from what you're saying, because just you talking about it, I can see it just lights you up. I can just see that.
Well, it does, and the wonderful part about it is he actually wrote the afterword for the book. So that's how on board he was. He was willing to tell his part of the story in the afterword.
That's great. And to have that chapter, to have that narration we were saying earlier, that piece to understand what's happened and in the relationship, that there's something really, really powerful with all that. And I think that's really.
I was just gonna say, I hope that the book itself, and I hope our reconciliation is inspiring to others and holds out the possibility that it can happen, even after decades of silence. So, but it's difficult. It's not, how do you actually build a relationship with somebody who you can't, who you don't know if you can trust. And that was a big piece of the experience of writing the book and capturing the reconciliation.
Well, I think that what you mentioned there is really, really important, in that there's that sense of trust, as you say. And trust is really powerful, because you probably, and it probably hit him too, is you guys probably had little tests for each other to kind of see in some ways, can I open up more with him about this, or can I go a little bit deeper with that person, you know? So he probably had that, and you guys had that back and forth, and there's almost like a certain dance that's associated to that. And once you're able to do that, then you've cultivated the elements and the foundation to be able to have the conversation, to be safe enough to be able to have that. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of sibling relationships. It's to cultivate that foundation of being able to talk in a safe place about those pains and those hurts.
Well, I know we're almost out of time, but I want to conclude by saying that this never would have happened at any other point in our lives. And I think that's an important part of reconciliation. And that is this idea that sibling relationships evolve and change. And there will be moments where there's closeness and where there's distance, even in a normal functioning relationship. I'm not sure my brother and I could have reconciled a moment earlier than we did. Neither one of us was ready until that time.
Yes. And that's something that's really, really important. What you just said there is the notion of the timing. I think timing for these type of things is everything. And he needed to get to that point to be able to experience enough discomfort to use that as a catapult for change. And this is something that's often talked about in substance abuse treatment. And I'm glad that happened. And clearly you were ready, you were ripe for that conversation. So and both of you were ready to have it. And that's what's so great about this, is that when it happens, when all the elements are there and there's that sense of mutual respect, there's that sense of openness, there's that sense of making room for each other's personalities, then everything about that makes that the dynamic of sibling estrangement doesn't play itself out anymore. But you were actually able to have an alternative conversation, an alternative path to the relationship that both of you have chosen to do. So at the fork in the road, you both decided, instead of going this way, we're going to go this way. And that's what you guys did. And it's such a wonderful experience to be able to do that when you're able to walk together like that. So hats off to you for being able to
Thank you.
Absolutely. What's the title of your book again, Fern, if I can ask?
It's called Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, Sibling Estrangement and the Road to Reconciliation. So
You got to look
I'm
out
sure
for
we'll be talking more about it, and I hope we'll have more of these conversations.
I would love to, and this is a first introduction talk that we've done together in that way. We connected initially before. I just want to let our viewers know, of course, but this is the first time we're recording this, and I think this is a conversation to be had. And I think that it'll be certainly fruitful for others to see that we can put words to these mutual experiences that we all have regarding sibling estrangement. So I really want to thank you for this. This is a great moment, and I really do hope that we can, of course, continue to do this again, Fern. If you're open to this, I'm open to this. So
I am too.
Excellent. So
Anyway, thank you too.
It's my pleasure, and we'll look at different themes too. If there's anything in the future that we can look at that would certainly be of interest to our viewers, then we can certainly delve deeper into that. So absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. This is a really enriching moment to be able to bear witness to this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.